Hey there folks, the number one Arooj Aftab fan from the Infinite Jukebox here with another album review, and today I wanted to talk about the new Arooj Aftab record, Night Rain. Arooj Aftab has emerged in recent years as one of the most immediately engaging, gripping, interesting, fresh-faced singer-songwriter types out there active in the music industry at the moment. I mean, between her combination and incorporation of various influences from the overall South Asian diaspora, particularly from Pakistan, and her often ethereal vocal performances in her best moments behind the mic, it really does feel like she stands out within the realm of singer-songwriter types, and considering there is a pretty constant truth throughout music history that there will forever be an infinite amount of people with a guitar and something to say that are trying to make it in the music industry, it does take a lot to really stick out in any way in particular. So the fact that Arooj Aftab can, in a variety of ways, is something to commend her for, and as a whole, whether you click with her music or not, I don't really think there's any denying that she, at least from a perspective of artistic uniqueness alone, deserves the commercial and critical heights that she has reached thus far, as well as any that she may reach in the future. Even still, she just hasn't been around quite long enough to really properly call her a master of her craft or anything like that, but I think that kind of goes without saying, even if records like 2021's Vulture Prince, her breakthrough studio album, arguably are fantastic and highly recommendable nonetheless. But here we are with her latest studio album, Night Rain, and I would say that with this being her first entirely solo studio album in 3 years, we see another addition to an impeccable discography that is staying impeccable, while also encouraging a number of people to rightfully find her as one of the most striking singer-songwriter folk-type musicians of the decade thus far. Perhaps the most immediately interesting thing about Night Rain as a record is that throughout its runtime, it manages to pick up a number of jazz-based influences, or at least jazz-adjacent sounds that arguably we've never really seen from the Arooj Aftab discography before, at least not to the same extent that we do here, certainly not on her solo work. And I say solo work in particular because these jazz influences can be traced back to a previous project of hers, specifically 2023's Love in Exile, a pretty solid record overall, but more importantly, a record that saw her cross paths with more decidedly jazz-based artists, Vijay Iyer as well as Shahzad Ismaili, two artists who are pretty directly involved in jazz, associated with the overarching jazz scene, much more than Arooj Aftab generally speaking is. And I think that a lot of those sounds and influences and a lot of those jazz-based inspirations carry over into this record here in a way that I think is entirely unique from its predecessor, and ultimately allows her to kind of reinvent her solo work a little bit. And look, I'll admit, Love in Exile, not my favorite album of all time or anything like that. I didn't even really cover it on this channel because I didn't have anything to say about it when it came out, and I still don't really have much to say about it now. But I digress. My point is, despite not being a particularly groundbreaking release for any of the parties involved, it does obviously have an impact on how Night Rain developed stylistically, and honestly, I think it's for the better here. A lot of these jazz influences come in through various forms at different moments on this record, from the occasional Billie Holiday-esque vocal deliveries that you get from Aftab herself, the sort of vocal jazz style, while she never really loses her own vocal inflections that make her a unique performer from a vocal standpoint, and I think that's especially an impressive feat on tracks like Last Night Reprise, for example, considering Aftab already has a pretty stunning voice in her best moments without further embracing the sort of archetypal melancholy of many of the great jazz vocalists of a time period that has long since come to pass. But I digress. You also see a lot of the raw and unfiltered upright bass lines of various people on this record, like Petros Kalampinis or Linda O, for example. I think that there really is a lot of pretty intense jazz instrumentation here that doesn't necessarily overwhelm the record with jazz influence, but certainly does add a very different and unexpected tone to a solo Arooj Aftab record that I think, while it has been shown in some of her previous material, never to the extent on this album, and personally I greatly welcome it. It certainly does help that a number of jazz instrumentalists and performers, or at the very least artists who have experimented with jazz and various forms of it in the past, do come about here as features and provide some pretty strong feature material overall, never overshadowing Arooj herself, but at the same time still managing to stand out as features that have purpose on the record, and arguably do things that Aftab could not have done as well or as successfully executed as if she had done it herself. This includes, but is not limited to, More Mother's extremely powerful spoken word performance on the track Bolo Na, Chocolate Genius's sort of ECM-style multi-instrumentalist work on the album closing track Zamin, as well as Vijay Iyer's piano work, crossing paths with Aftab again after Love in Exile last year on the track Saki, for example. I think that as a whole, all of these appearances from various individuals that either dedicate themselves or at the very least have flirted with the ideas of jazz and the various concepts surrounding the more underground and experimental side of it is something that allows Night Rain to develop its own artistic identity into something that feels unique both in the context of the Arooj Aftab discography and in the context of jazz-influenced non-jazz music at large. So yeah, all of the jazz sounds, all of the jazz-based ideas, concepts being put on display here certainly go farther with those ideas than Aftab's entirely solo work ever has before, and that's something that you can contribute in terms of credit to both Aftab herself as well as her various collaborators here on this record, and more importantly, arguably, about the jazz influences is that they heavily play into some of the generally nocturnal atmospheres and themes that this album is deeply rooted in. In fact, it feels pretty essential at times for this record to maintain that kind of atmosphere, another major selling point of it, if I'm being completely honest. As you probably guessed from the album title, Night Rain, it's a record that has a lot to do with the nighttime. Crazy, I know, I probably just blew your little mind. But it is a record heavily structured around nighttime, the various feelings that come with the sort of nocturnal vibe that you get at nighttime, whether you're walking around a more countryside sort of area or in a more urban region. No matter what, you always get this sort of, I guess you could say, slight melancholy that it kind of comes with a nocturnal atmosphere, and that's certainly translated into this record overall. And with Aftab citing this as being a record inspired by the nighttime and her own night owl habits, so to speak, it feels like, seeing as those are direct inspiration for the creation of this record in particular, that this is arguably her most mystifying record to date. An album that's heavily cloaked in shadows intentionally, while at the same time never being afraid of vulnerability in terms of her actual performances and the ideas behind them. It's the sort of balance of the real nighttime that you get between the sort of shadowy, sort of hidden kind of qualities that you get from the very existence of nighttime, the darkness and the general kind of mystery that comes with being out and about and doing things at a time of day where not nearly as many people are doing the same as you, as well as the kind of same emotions that come with that. I mean, I think I speak for a lot of people when I say that the nighttime is kind of a place of great solitude in a very positive way, of course, because it ultimately provides you this sort of semi-melancholy, semi-joy that's very hard to describe, and not necessarily everyone can agree that they feel when nighttime comes about. But I digress. As someone who can relate to Arooj Aftab in terms of being put into a very specific feeling and mood at the nighttime and really enjoying that point of the day more than the rest of the day, I can certainly see how a lot of those feelings are translated over into this record, and I think that they are really done beautifully here. I mean, there's something particularly special and moving about the empty serenity of the still of the night if you happen to be in the right place at the right time with the right frame of mind. And I think that that is something that is really well translated into this album overall. I mean, the beauty of the night and its stillness and the sort of subtle intricacies of existence sort of allowing themselves to shine into our day-to-day life as you realize how essential people feel, how essential movement feels, how essential a lot of activity being around you when you are out in a public area feels. All of those being kind of stripped away to reveal their importance to you at the nighttime. It really does feel like a lot of that bittersweetness is being highlighted here on this record, and it is something that I personally deeply enjoy. And I actually think it's kind of interesting that various points of this record sound like nighttime in different areas. Some of the most raw moments here are nighttime in an empty field, and then some of the more processed or well-produced moments here come across like nighttime in an otherwise bustling town that is now sleeping and heavily inactive. I think you get my point. And ultimately, I think that this is something that plays into the overall success of the album and the track list, because there is a degree of variation throughout this same atmosphere while staying rooted in these same emotions that make it such a moving album in its best moments. It's a record that knows how to fluctuate between different concepts while staying within the same ballpark, if you want to put it that way, sort of keeping things in line by having consistent ideas and emotions being presented, but presenting them in different ways or in different tones, that ultimately the record never becomes one note or dry or stale, but it never breaks away from the atmosphere that it has, and I ultimately think that's a wonderful thing. As someone who really loves extremely fluid records like this, it's great to see an album that knows how to provide variety and to keep the listener engaged while at the same time never really breaking any sort of immersion within the context of its own confines. So yeah, the fact that Night Rain is able to flow and change and be fluid throughout its runtime without ever really deviating from the qualities that make it such a special record in the first place, and maybe my favorite Arooj Aftab record to date in the first place, is something that's really nice to see overall. I think that it's really great when a record, like I said, can manage to provide variety and keep the listener really engaged with the material at hand via variation, while at the same time never breaking away from what can make an album extremely immersive. So again, it's a quality that I really like about this album, and I'm happy to hype that up as much as I possibly can in this video. Arooj Aftab is a deeply unique songwriter, and her latest studio album, Night Rain, continues to prove that as a pretty objective truth, I would almost say. Like I said at the beginning of this video, I really do think that even if you don't click with her music, it is almost impossible to deny that there's not really anyone, at least super major within the realm of alternative music, or in the realm of getting nominated for Grammys, that's making music that sounds exactly like hers, and I think that she does deserve credit in that regard, whether you enjoy her work or not. It just so happens that I greatly enjoy her work, and more importantly, I think that Night Rain is a newfound take on her signature ambience that hones in on some jazz influences, a peaceful embrace of the nighttime in a way that I think ultimately adds up into maybe my favorite record of hers to date. It consistently feels extremely impressive how well things are handled here, ranging from the atmosphere to the features from various different artists that range from involved directly in the jazz world to mildly associated with it to just being involved within the alternative and underground music world in general. I think that as a whole, this is an album that kind of has everything it possibly could going for it. It's an extremely well-executed album, and while I don't think it's a magnum opus, and I think that she still has a lot of potential to make something even better than this, it is a pretty flawless album that I don't have a huge amount of complaints to direct towards. I'm going to give this record 4 stars out of 5. And with that being said, that is the end of this album review. Thank you for watching The Infinite Jukebox, and I'll see you in the next one.